Do you believe in fate? A lonely rancher found a special baby lying all alone on a dusty dirt road. What he did next took the whole town by surprise. And it ended up revealing a secret many hoped would stay hidden. Get ready. This story will challenge everything you thought you knew about right and wrong. Silence ruled that dry land like even the wind had given up. Mark, the rancher who lived up on the hill, was more ghost than man. He'd been living alone for years, far from town, in a house that creaked with abandonment and held more memories than furniture. The porch wood was rotting, the roof caked in dust, and the rusted gates barely moved. Time had stopped on that property, and in him too. At 39, Mark carried in his sunken, sorrowful eyes the weight of someone whose life had fallen apart. His sun-beaten skin hid a story no one dared to whisper anymore. He had lost his wife, Claire, and their little boy, Michael, in a cruel accident that split his soul in two. They said a herd of cattle got loose and flipped the carriage they were riding. Since that day, he stopped speaking to the world, and the world stopped remembering he existed. He'd cut ties with everything: Sunday Mass, town fairs, the neighbors. Even his relatives stopped writing long ago. He lived off the land, when it let him. Raised a few chickens, planted beans and corn, and looked after a lame old horse. His only companion was silence. Inside the house, absence hung in the air like a weight. The boys' room stayed locked, untouched. The small bed still made up with a thin sheet, toys packed in boxes above the wardrobe, the fading marks of childhood slowly erased by time. In the couple's bedroom, the smell of mold clung to the clothes Claire had left behind. A black and white photo of the three of them still hung slightly crooked on the living room wall. It was the only human face Mark still let himself live with. He didn't speak to anyone in town. When he needed something, salt, medicine, a new machete blade, he'd ride or walk to the general store, buy what he needed in silence, nod a quick thanks, and leave. People said he'd gone mad, that he talked to walls, that he heard voices. Kids ran from him like he was a ghost story. But Mark didn't care. He had no one left to live for. His routine was hard, colorless, and strict. He rose before the sun, drank a gulp of bitter black coffee, cleared weeds, worked the fields, fed the animals. In the afternoon, he'd sit on the porch with his hat pulled low and listen to the forest's quiet hum. At night, he'd eat whatever was around, go to bed early. No lights, no prayers, no hope. He didn't dream. He didn't expect. He just existed. But the nights were often the cruelest. When the sky was clear and the stars burned bright, he'd remember Claire's face, the smell of Michael's hair, the laughter that once echoed through the halls. On those nights, he'd clench his fists tight and whisper a single name. Michael! That was all he had left to say. All he had left to feel. And still, even in that bitter, aimless existence, he believed life had already shown him all it had to give. That fate had already poured every drop of pain it had into him. That nothing could surprise him anymore. But he was wrong. He had no idea that life, stubborn, wild, and full of secrets, still had one last twist in store. Something that would come unannounced on an ordinary afternoon, shatter the silence of that house, and drag out, kicking and screaming, a flicker of humanity he thought had died long ago. Something so small, so fragile, yet strong enough to wake a heart that had been asleep for years. The next morning dawned gray. Mist crawled across the fields like it too had grown tired of existing. Mark, as always, was up before the sun. He brewed strong, bitter coffee, just like his life. Silence was sacred in that house, broken only by the groan of old floorboards and the hiss of the kettle on the wood stove. There was no rush, just routine. But that day, he had to head down to town for coarse salt, pig feed, and to fix a broken tractor part. It was a long ride, over 2 hours on horseback, hat low over his brow, head full of wordless thoughts. Mark hated going to town. People stared too much. They didn't talk to him, but they sure whispered to each other. He didn't care what they said anymore. But he still avoided it. Avoided everyone. The sky darkened on his way back. The clouds clamped shut like tight fists, and the smell of rain carried a sense of warning he couldn't quite name. The horse's hooves thudded rhythmically against the damp dirt road. Each step felt heavier, like it was pressing his memories deeper into the ground. And then he heard it. Faint, cut through the soft patter of rain. A cry. Short, gasping, like life itself was barely hanging on to the sound. He pulled the reins. The horse snorted, uneasy. Mark dismounted slowly, eyes scanning the brush along the roadside. The cry stopped. Then came again, even weaker. It was coming from the thin weeds, just past a broken fence. His heart, used to silence, thumped differently. He stepped closer. The ground was damp. The leaves, slick. And there, in an old, soaked wicker basket lined with filthy rags, was the impossible. A baby. Tiny. Curled up. Face smudged with dirt and tears. Pale, cold skin. Shivering. Its eyes barely able to open. But what struck him most was the leg, shriveled, twisted in a way that looked wrong. Like it had never finished growing. He froze. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. That old rural survival instinct screamed at him, "Don't get involved." But something louder rose in his chest. Something ancient. A memory from a time when his arms had held a baby once too. His own, the one that never got to grow. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees. Gently lifted the baby into his arms, hands steadier than he remembered having. The child cried louder from the movement. It was alive. Fragile, but alive. Mark stripped off his coat and wrapped it around the baby. Looked around, half expecting someone, anyone, to appear. No one. Nothing but the sound of rain growing heavier and the silence pressing in. The road home was long, but the rancher didn't hesitate. He mounted his horse with the baby tucked close to his chest, wrapped in his own coat. He rode hard, feeling the urgency in the wind, in the cold water running down his back. He arrived after dark, soaked to the bone, but the baby was still warm against his skin. He lit a fire, boiled water, tore up old sheets to make makeshift diapers, looked for milk, found some goat's milk, heated it, cooled it, tested the temperature on his lips. Like a father. Like a man who had no idea what he was doing, but knew deep down he couldn't let this tiny thing die. Hours later, the baby slept in his bed. Mark watched from a distance. The deformity was obvious. But that's not what got to him. It was the abandonment. Who would do this? He muttered, staring at the fire like it might answer him. No note. No mark. Nothing. But something felt off. That baby hadn't been left there by accident. That road, that spot, that time. It felt planned. And no matter how hard he tried to shake it, one question burned. Who wanted this child dead? Or worse, who didn't want him alive? He stayed up all night. The next morning, as the early sun slipped through the cracks in the shutters, Mark sat at the table with a mug of coffee and the baby sleeping beside him. He studied the small face, the delicate features. Something inside him was shifting. After years of silence, a new presence filled that house. Fragile, defenseless, cast aside by the world, just like he felt inside. Maybe that's why the pull had been so strong. He didn't know where the child came from, or why. But one thing was certain. It wasn't random. And he wasn't going to let this baby be forgotten like he had been. By late morning, with the child wrapped in a blanket inside a sturdy basket, Mark saddled his horse and headed to town. He hated the idea of being seen, especially with a baby in his arms. He knew people would stare, whisper, but he had no choice. The midwife, Miss Nilda, lived in a small house with a faded blue door at the edge of town. She was in her 70s, sharp-tongued, steady-handed, with a memory like steel. She delivered nearly every child in that town, including Mark's son, Michael, years ago. He dismounted and knocked. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet and the air heavy. Nilda opened the door with a frown, ready to chase off a salesman, but her eyes widened when she saw Mark holding the basket. "Dear God," she whispered, "is that yours?" "Found him by the old fence on our Lindo's land," he said plainly. "Alone. In the rain. Crying." She let him in without another word. Took the baby gently, like holding a secret. She checked his eyes, breathing, skin, the twisted leg. Whispered to herself, lips moving silently. "It's a miracle he's alive," she said at last. "With that cold night and that fragile little body, he should have been stiff by morning." Mark nodded, but what he wanted wasn't a diagnosis. It was an answer. "You know where he came from?" Nilda looked at the baby again, paused, as if weighing something inside her, then murmured without meaning to, "That little face reminds me of someone. Someone from the Colonel's house." The name dropped like a stone in deep water. "From Colonel Dawson's place?" Mark asked, voice tight. She stepped back. "I didn't say that," she replied quickly. "It's just, I've seen so many faces, so many births, but this boy, the nose maybe, the eyes." "His wife had a baby?" Mark pressed. Nilda hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "She vanished a few days ago. The Colonel said she went to visit family, but no one's seen her or the baby since, and no one here knows of any family. She was quiet, but troubled. Far too young for that man. Anna Beatrice, right?" he asked. "Yeah." "Quiet, pretty, but always looked sad," the midwife said softly. "Always seemed scared." She lowered her voice. "Now listen, Mark. If this baby's hers, and if he was left there, something ugly is going on behind the curtain." Mark clenched his jaw. Something inside him burned. It wasn't just outrage. It was something deeper. A bitter recognition. On the ride home, the horse moved slower, like it too felt the weight of what they were carrying. Mark stared up at the cloudy sky, but the real storm was building inside. He thought of Anna Beatrice, young, locked away in that house without a voice. He thought of the Colonel, an old man, feared by all, who owned everything. And he thought of the baby, the twisted leg, the basket, the exact spot it was left. That wasn't desperation. That was disposal. And it made his stomach turn. His blood boiled. Because he knew what it meant to lose a child. But to throw one away, like trash. In the days that followed, Mark began asking around, carefully, without raising eyebrows. He stopped by the general store, the butcher's, the feed shop. He listened more than he spoke. "They say the Colonel's wife went missing," he overheard one afternoon at the local bar. "Hasn't been seen since the baby was born." Weird, right? The Colonel says she got sick, went to visit her folks. But no one saw her leave. No car. No nothing. He fired the cook last week. Now it's just him and his 2 hired guns. Place is locked up tight. Mark said nothing. Every word was a puzzle piece. And slowly, the pieces began to fit. That night, the house felt different. It wasn't just the warmth of the fireplace or the smell of the porridge he'd just made. It was the sound, a baby's soft laughter, echoing through walls that had known only silence for years. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, the baby in his arms, fed, clean, wrapped in a wool blanket that once belonged to his son. The boy, because that's how he thought of him now, stared up at him with tiny dark eyes, like he could see through time. Mark smiled. A real smile. For the first time in ages. "You know, kid," he whispered, adjusting the baby in his arm, "I thought I had nothing left to live for. Nothing that could make me get out of bed with a lighter heart, and then you showed up. The baby made a funny little sound, almost a laugh, and something broke inside Mark. In a good way, like the walls around his heart had cracked, finally, from the inside out. He stroked the baby's soft face and spoke again, voice low and trembling. I don't know who did this to you, or why, but I'm gonna find out. And I'll get justice. For you. For your mother. For everything they took from you. The baby waved his little arms, clutching at the wrinkles in Mark's shirt. No one's throwing you away again, you hear me? He said, voice firm now. You're gonna grow up here. With dignity. With love. And if your mother's still alive, I'm gonna bring her back. Even if I have to face the devil himself. The baby cooed again. Smiled. And that smile. That was the final piece that changed Mark completely. The pain he'd carried for years was replaced by something new. Not just hope, purpose, strength. In that moment, holding the child in his arms, Mark wasn't a broken man anymore. He was a man who, for the first time in years, knew exactly what he had to do. He kissed the baby's forehead gently and whispered like a vow. We're gonna find out the truth, little guy, and show this world that people who love don't give up. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, damp with midnight rain. But inside that house, once filled only with shadows, a spark of life had taken root, and it grew with every beat of his heart. The days that followed were restless. Mark wasn't the same man who used to avoid town and lower his gaze. Now, he walked with purpose, eyes steady, face still weathered but alert. He took the baby everywhere, wrapped in blankets, protected from the cold, and from being forgotten. In town, the gossip didn't stop, but now, it shifted. The widower from the hills been seen walking around with a baby. They say he found it abandoned, but no one knows where it came from. And that's exactly what Mark needed. Voices, bits, clues. That morning, he walked into the village's small grocery shop. The doorbell chimed overhead. Inside, the air smelled of flour, lye soap, and onions. The clerk nodded a greeting. Only one other man was there, a tall ranch hand in a sweat-stained shirt and worn-out straw hat, bagging rice. It was Ben, one of Colonel Dawson's cowhands. Mark stepped up to the counter, pretending to look at nails and soap, grabbed some feed, spun a can of oil in his hand. Then, without looking directly at the man, he asked low, "The Colonel's wife, still out of town?" The man paused, pretended not to hear. Mark pushed a little more. Heard she had a baby, but no one's seen her, or the child. The ranch hand shrugged, looked around, murmured, "Yeah, she had one. I saw her, from a distance. Colonel brought in some midwife from out of town. Quiet delivery. No one was supposed to know." Mark didn't say a word, but his hand squeezed the can tight. "It was a boy," the man went on. "But he had something wrong with his leg, I heard. Born crippled." The word hit like a blade. Next day, the man lowered his voice even more. Colonel made the baby disappear. Said to get rid of it. No one knows where it went. She screamed like hell, they say. So he locked her in a room. Mark felt the blood pounding in his temples. "And nobody did anything?" he asked, struggling to keep his anger in check. "Who's gonna go up against the Colonel?" the man said, shaking his head. "He calls the shots. He's done worse before. Folks have vanished for less." Marcos took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He paid for his groceries, nodded in thanks, and walked out. But inside, something was burning. That night, while the baby slept with a peaceful rhythm, Marcos opened an old box in the back of the closet. Inside were fragments of the past, ropes, lanterns, a rusty revolver, a pair of boots he hadn't worn in years. He began to clean, sort, test. Each move was steady, silent, intentional. He wasn't a violent man, but he wasn't a coward either. In the days that followed, he barely left the house. But he watched, studied the colonel's ranch from afar, learned the routines, who came, who left, how many guards, which gate stayed locked, and where the fence was weak. He started to plan. At night, he'd talk to the baby, as if the two of them were sketching it out together. Saturday night fell over the village like a blanket of noise and distraction. The streets buzzed with music, laughter, and hurried steps toward the town square, where the celebration would carry on late into the night. Lanterns flickered, and the air was thick with the smell of fresh food and sugarcane liquor. It was the perfect moment to move. Marcos left the baby in the steady, capable hands of Mrs. Nilda, the village midwife. She welcomed him with a protective gaze and a firm nod. "Go ahead, Marcos. I'll take care of him. You be careful." He nodded, a lump catching in his throat. That child was all they had left, and he trusted Nilda to be the rock while he did what had to be done. Dressed in black, with worn boots and his hat pulled low over his brow, Marcos walked silently toward Colonel Anderson's sprawling estate. The house was surrounded by tall walls, with 2 guards stationed at the front, watchful eyes, hands never far from their guns. He held his breath, studying the movement. He knew walking through the front door would be suicide. That's when the plan became action. Marcos circled around the property, spotting an old wooden ladder leaning against the roof. He climbed slowly, every step deliberate, his heart pounding like a war drum. Reaching the rooftop, he crawled toward a dimly lit, half-open window. With steady hands, he eased it open just enough to slip inside. The air was cold and heavy. The silence screamed of secrets held under lock and key. He moved up the stairs toward the attic, guided by the faint sound of muffled crying. The door was locked, but Marcos had brought a small wire cutter. Holding his breath, he worked the latch. Inside, he found Anna Benson, pale, her eyes swollen from days of tears, dressed in simple clothes, her hair tangled and unkempt. "Who are you?" she whispered. Marcos took her hands and answered, voice low but sure. "I have your baby, Anna." She gasped, her chest heaving. Then, in a breath that was more sob than sentence, "My David, he's alive?" "He is," Marcos said, offering a faint, sad smile. "He's safe. With Mrs. Nilda." Anna dropped her head, tears welling again. In a soft, desperate voice, she pleaded, "Please, get me out of here." Before she could say another word, heavy footsteps thundered down the hall. The attic door burst open with a crash. Colonel Anderson stormed in, face red with fury, eyes burning with hatred. "Well, well, you must be the damn farmer who thought it was a good idea to stick his nose where it doesn't belong," he sneered, voice thick with sarcasm. "Did you really think you could waltz into my house and walk away untouched? How precious." Marcos squared his shoulders, eyes locked on the man with contempt. "You locked her up like an animal," he said, voice steady, "and threw away her child like garbage. That ends now." The colonel laughed, loud, mocking. "Garbage? You pathetic nobody. You've got no idea who you're messing with. I run this place, and nobody takes what's mine." Without warning, he lunged forward, shoving Marcos hard. From the hallway, the guards appeared, weapons drawn, eyes cold, lips curled in wicked grins. "You're gonna regret this day," the colonel growled. Marcos raised his hands, facing them with a courage that came from deep inside, beyond logic, beyond fear. "If it's to protect what's right, then bring it on." One of the guards, a big man gripping a club, stepped forward. Mark dodged at the last second, adrenaline surging through his veins. He struck back with a solid punch that sent the thug crashing to the floor with a heavy thud. Another one lunged at him. Mark ducked, grabbed the man's arm, and spun, slamming him hard against the wall. Anna tried to run, bolting for the door, but a third thug blocked her way, grabbing her arm. "Let go of me!" she shouted, struggling. Mark heard her cry. With a leap, he landed a fierce punch on the thug's face, forcing him to release her. The house turned into a battleground, punches flying, shouts echoing, bodies slamming into walls, and floorboards creaking under their feet. Suddenly, a young maid appeared at the staircase, breathless, eyes wide with fear. She looked at Mark and whispered urgently, "I can help you. I know where the colonel hides the key to the main door." Mark gave her a quick nod of thanks. Seizing the moment, he pulled Anna close. "Let's get out of here. Now." Following the maid's directions, Mark found the key hidden behind a loose board in the hallway wall. With shaking hands, he unlocked the back door. The thugs, realizing the escape, shouted commands and gave chase. They ran through the dark trail in the brush, a light rain starting to soak their clothes and faces, mixing with sweat and fear. By the time they reached Miss Nilda's modest home, the village midwife, the door opened fast. She was waiting, tense and watchful. When she saw baby David in Mark's arms, Miss Nilda dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Her arms wrapped around the child with a tenderness that held the weight of all the pain they'd endured. "My boy," she whispered, voice breaking as she cradled David against her chest. "My sweet boy." Anna, overwhelmed, leaned her head against the doorframe, sobbing softly, her breath shaky as relief and hope poured through her. Mark looked at them, a calm, steady smile lighting up his face. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the sky clean, while inside that little house, a new life was beginning to shine. While they were lost in the moment of reunion, they had no idea that, even as they escaped, an unseen ally was already working to bring down the colonel. The same young maid who had helped them, who had shown Mark the key, hadn't wasted a single second. Using the chaos of the village celebration as cover, she had rushed to the colonel's office and called the police in the neighboring town. With a trembling voice, she told them everything she knew: Anna's illegal imprisonment, the abandoned baby, and all of Colonel Adley's crimes. That very same Saturday night, the regional newspapers exploded with the headline, "Colonel Adley arrested for kidnapping, child endangerment, and other serious charges." The news spread through the village like wildfire. The party turned into whispers, joy gave way to fear, and justice. Just hours later, a police task force surrounded the ranch with swift precision. Colonel Adley, caught off guard and cornered, was taken away in handcuffs under the stunned stares of his neighbors. Months had passed since that stormy night when Mark, Anna, and little David escaped the colonel's clutches. The memories of that chaos still haunted Mark's dreams now and then, the sound of rain on the roof, the smell of gunpowder, Anna's scream echoing in the dark. But now, those were distant memories, overshadowed by the new life they were building. The village had changed. The colonel's arrest brought a new kind of silence, not one born of fear, but of peace. For the first time in years, people walked the streets without glancing over their shoulders. Children ran between houses without their mothers fearing gunshots in the distance. Justice had finally found its way. Mark, once a forgotten solitary man, was someone else now. The darkness in his eyes had been replaced by a gentle light. He had become a devoted father, a loyal partner, and a symbol of courage to the entire village. People who once crossed the street to avoid him now called on him to fix fences, guide the youth, or share stories by the fire. Anna blossomed. The woman who arrived at the village broken in body and spirit had been reborn. It was as if, by facing the worst, she had found herself. Her steps were steady, her voice confident. She worked alongside Mark on the farm with joy, planting flowers around the porch, teaching David to walk, and tending to the chickens as if caring for a whole family. David was growing like a ray of sunshine. You couldn't help but smile watching him play with Mark's dog or hearing his laughter as the wind ruffled his hair. He was living proof that love can heal what pain tries to erase. The farm, once dry and forgotten land, was now blooming. The fences were mended, the crops were thriving again, and the wooden porch filled the mornings with the warm scent of fresh coffee. It wasn't just a house. It was home. Little by little, the invisible wounds began to heal too. Mark and Anna had long talks at night, after David was asleep. They opened up about their fears, their pain, the pasts they had each carried alone. Mark spoke of his missing brother, and how he felt lonely even surrounded by people. Anna spoke of her absent father, her mother's abandonment, and the humiliation she endured before coming there. In those conversations, they found comfort. It was as if sharing their stories helped cleanse old scars. And in the silence that followed, a single look was enough to say, "I've got you now." It wasn't long before Mark made the decision that would change their lives forever. One morning, while Anna was hanging clothes in the sun, he walked up to her holding a small wooden box. He didn't say a word. He simply got down on one knee, opened the box, and revealed a delicate handmade ring, silver he had melted himself, with a soft blue stone he'd found in the river. Anna gasped, covering her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't have riches, Anna," he said, voice trembling. "But I have love, courage, and a deep, burning desire to wake up next to you every single morning. Will you marry me?" She didn't answer with words. She just dropped to her knees beside him and held him tight. The wedding was simple, but unforgettable. News of it spread quickly through the village. Even those who'd once kept their distance from Mark showed up, some out of curiosity, others out of respect, and many out of true affection. It happened on a golden spring afternoon, under a clear sky, with sunflowers swaying gently in the breeze. The ceremony took place beneath the wide canopy of an old tree on the hill above the farm. Anna wore a white dress sewn by the neighbor women, light linen with lace on the sleeves and a pale blue ribbon at the waist. Her hair was braided over one shoulder, with tiny flowers woven into the strands. Mark wore a clean white shirt, linen trousers, and an old pair of suspenders that had belonged to his father. He was nervous, but his eyes never left hers. David walked down the aisle on his crutches, carrying the rings in a little straw nest. The guests smiled and clapped softly, touched by the sight. There was no priest. It was Miss Celia, the village midwife, who led the ceremony. Her voice steady and full of emotion, she said, "Today, we're not just witnessing a wedding. We're witnessing the power of love that endures, of forgiveness that heals, and of hope that never dies." When Mark slipped the ring onto Anna's finger, his eyes filled with tears. "With you, I learned how to live again," he whispered. And Anna replied, "With you, I learned what it means to truly be loved." Their kiss was long and silent, and in that moment, even the birds seemed to fall quiet in reverence. Then the celebration began. Barefoot children ran through the grass, elders danced, and Mark and Anna didn't leave each other's side for a second.